I decided to go at this a little differently. I'm going to work through a couple of small but non-trivial examples just to give you an idea of how Groovy can be used, and by doing that I'll be able to bring up features and show you how things work. Now, in some of the applications I was not able to grab all the source code to show it in the slides, but all the source code that I have will be made available to you. We'll go through Dave on that. I'll make sure that you can get it anywhere you like. I'll probably give it to him as an archive, or maybe check it into a source code repository, or whatever we like. But any code that I have available or that I talk about here, you're more than welcome to. Okay. So this is a rough idea of what we're going to do. I'll give you just a tiny bit of background about me, and then we'll talk a bit about Groovy. But again, I don't want to get bogged down in motivating all this. I figure if you're here, you probably already have some reason that you're interested in Groovy. I'd rather get into the actual code. Developers like to see code, and show you how Groovy makes life simpler, especially for Java developers, where all of that comes in. And then that should lead to questions automatically. When we get through the various applications, then I'll be able to say, all right, let's step back and look at the big picture and see where this is being used in industry and in practice, what the use cases are for it and everything. I'll give you a few references at the end. This presentation will also be made available to you after the fact, and I believe we'll also have SkillBuilders keeps a recording of all of their webinars as well. So you'll be able to get anything that you see here today. Just a brief slide about my own background. It's Ken Cousin like the relative. It doesn't look like it. We think it's an Ellis Island job or something. I've been a technical trainer for about a decade now. I've been working in the IT industry for much longer than that, mostly as a developer, some consulting stuff. My email address for SkillBuilders is listed there. You can go through that address. I also have a homepage listed and my Twitter account as well if you like, if you're interested in any of that. I've got various certifications back, several years ago when getting certifications was very popular in the Java community, and a bunch of academic degrees. And if you have any other questions about my background, feel free to contact me or check me online or whatever. But just say I've been working with this stuff for a long time. I do everything from all the Java-related areas, open source areas like Spring Framework or Hibernate, as well as XML things like style sheets and transformations and web services, etc. All right, what is Groovy? Groovy is actually a programming language. It is a separate language, but it's one of a family of languages that has a unique relationship to Java. The idea is that Groovy code compiles to Java bytecodes. So even though you're writing in a different language, when you actually compile the code, it turns into bytecodes that run on the JVM. And this means that it works really easily with Java and works on your existing infrastructure. For example, deployment of Groovy code is exactly the same as deployment of Java code. And as a matter of fact, you could easily mix Groovy and Java together. You just add another jar file to your distribution, and then everything works fine. We'll talk a bit more about that as we go along. Of all the languages that compile to the JVM, Groovy is by far the easiest one for Java developers to learn. It has a very Java-like syntax to it. It just simplifies things considerably, and I'll be showing you that as we go along. There are other languages that compile to the JVM that have various degrees of popularity. You may have heard of languages like Scala or Clojure or even JRuby for running Ruby code on the JVM. But Groovy was never intended to replace Java. Groovy is intended to supplement Java, to extend it and expand it and make it easier. It also lets us use these modern language features like closures and builders and metaprogramming. Some of these things I'll talk about. People have said Groovy is what Java would have looked like had it been invented in the 21st century. All right, enough of that. Let's actually run some Groovy. So what I'm doing here is I'm showing you some of the code. I also have available, let's see if that shows up okay. This is Spring Source Tool Suite. It's an Eclipse-based tool. There's a Groovy plugin for Eclipse, but I happen to like Spring Source Tool Suite because it also handles Grails applications very nicely. But I just thought I'd bring that up, and I'm hoping that font is big enough. Actually, now that I think about it, let me make that font one size bigger here, just to make it a little bit easier to see. Let me go up to 20 point. That ought to do it. And I'll close that and reopen it just to make sure. So there's the Groovy Hello World program. It's very different from Java, of course. Java, you have to put everything in a class. Java, you have to have a main method in that class if you're going to run an application. Groovy is able to, it does lots of classes too, which we'll look at, but it also does just plain old scripts. So here we see a regular program, a script, and it's using print line, and in fact that print line is a method. It doesn't look like a method because you don't see any parentheses, but in Groovy, parentheses are optional if it's obvious what's going on. Here they're supplying a string to the print line method. You also don't see any semicolons here. Semicolons are also optional. Now let me just run this just to prove that it does what I'm saying it does. And as soon as I execute it, you see there's our printout of Hello World. Now when you install Groovy, it comes with a nice console that you can use that's graphical and helpful, and it lets you test out scripts and things like that. Or, as I say, there are a variety of editors. There are modes that are supported in all the major IDEs like Eclipse here, STS, NetBeans has Groovy support, and I believe many of the core team members use IntelliJ's IDEA, which has excellent Groovy and Grail support. So the bottom line on that little script is, first of all, hey, it's only a script. Now, of course, this has got to run on the JVM, so it does have to get converted to bytecodes. If I took the Java P command, which interrogates bytecodes and tries to say what are the classes and what are the methods, you would find that it would take that script and wrap it inside a main method and extend a class in Groovy called script or something like that, and it's all happening under the hood. You don't have to worry about it. So one of the target audiences for Groovy would be people who do things in scripting languages, because this would give you the opportunity to write scripts in Java-like languages and integrate in with Java-like systems if you need to do that. It's all object-oriented and everything. So I mentioned the optional parentheses and the optional semicolons. I also happen to use deliberately this time single-quoted strings. Single quotes are used for strings, and double quotes are used for strings as well. There is a difference which we'll see in a moment. So that was the simplest of all possible applications. I mean, by law, I suppose every language has to show a Hello World application. Let me look at something a little bit more interesting. Now, this will be a simple one, and then I'll show a more complicated one. I want to access what these days we would probably call a kind of RESTful web service. I mean, it's not a full web service. You can't add anything, but it's a read-only web service. And what it is it's Google Chart. Now, Google Chart has its API. It's located at this URL, and you're able to create a URL string where you append data in the parameters, and Google returns a plot of the results. Now, I think I have this set up here. This is the Google Chart homepage that I was mentioning, and if I go into the Getting Started page, they show the elements of charts, and you can see the first example, of course, is a Hello World example. Now, I echoed this in our slides here. This is an access to Google Chart. Now, of course, this would all be on one line. So you send your request to this URL, chart.apis.google.com/chart?, and the rest of these things are all parameters. So, for example, CHS is the size of the chart in pixels. CHD is the data. This is text data in between 0 and 100. CHT here is the type. In this case, I'm asking for a three-dimensional pie chart. And CHL would be the labels. You see labels are separated by a vertical bar. So if you were to actually send this URL to, just type it in your browser, basically, this is what you get back. Here's the Hello World example. As a matter of fact, on that documentation page, this chart right here is actually, if you do a view source, they don't embed an image. They actually put in the URL and evaluate it. It's the source, the image, or rather the URL is embedded in the source attribute of an image tag, is how that shows. And they have lots of different kinds of charts, you know, various components and tons of different types. So let me do this sort of thing in Groovy, just to show you an example of how you could access a remote web service and then do something with the results. So I'm going to start off with a script that starts like this. Now, the word def here means that we're declaring a variable, but we're not determining what type it is. We're not committing to a type. It could be a string, could be a float, could be a double, could be the return value of a method. It could be anything. It means define, but we are going with what they call in Groovy optional typing. So we don't have to pick a data type. We can if we want. Groovy has optional typing. If I say string base, that's fine too. But if you don't care or you're not sure what you want to do with it yet, then you generally start off with dev.